Okay, everybody. So thank you for coming to this event. I'm David Jepson, as I've already said, and I think it's probably time to start. I'm sure a few more people will join us, but they can catch up as they do so. So this is the third in the series of seminars organised jointly between ACH and MMB. ACH is a leading provider of integration support for refugees and migrants, and MMB, Mobilities and Migration Bristol, is a specialist research institute in the University of Bristol focusing on migration issues. And we've been running these seminars for a while called Bridging the Gap. And the idea is to bridge the gap between research and analysis relating to these topics and delivery and policy development. It's always seemed to me for the last 30 years that there's a big gap in terms of how public policy is formulated because of that division between research and analysis on the one hand and delivery and policy on the second hand. And this seminar series is a small attempt to bridge that gap. And this particular topic is going to look at no recourse to public funds, which is an increasingly important and vital topic for us to examine. And in doing that, we have four really important speakers who I'll introduce in a second. I'm not an expert by any means on this topic. I'm chairing the event because Bridget Anderson, a professor at the university who normally does this, isn't available to do so. But I'm basically working with ACH on employment, economic development, and building stakeholder links. And it certainly seems to me that this topic is one which is going to be increasingly important to anybody who is concerned about migration, about refugees, or indeed about social justice in the years to come, because it seems that it's going to be an increasingly important topic. And just one or two little comments before we kick off. And one is that, I mean, I think no recourse to public funds is a name which is not what it says on the tin, to use a phrase, because as I understand it, for every family who is in that position, there's a huge impact to public spending of up to £19,000 per family per year, which can fall on local authorities. So it's actually a topic which a small number of people care deeply and rightly about, but which amongst a larger group of people involved in public policy and in political issues are not aware of the full implications of it. And that was the case for me until a couple of years ago. So I do think there's a big job to be done to demystify what this NRPF actually means, not just for those who are affected, which is clearly appalling, but for the wider society and community. And I think there are important links to the relationship between NRPF and employment, particularly precarious and marginal employment, and how do we see people in terms of being actors in the economy. A lot of people who are in NRPF have previously been working, and their role as economic actors and their role as citizens. How does that square up by creating a society where there are large numbers of people who don't have access to basic public services and benefits? What sort of society is that we're creating? But anyway, that's just a couple of remarks from me. Welcome the help of MMB, University of Bristol, and ACH in organising this event. We'll certainly have more in the future. Just ask you to mute your microphones while this event is on. It will be recorded, so if anybody objects to that, please say so now, because we are going to record it for future purposes. We'll mute you during the discussion, but please keep your cameras on so we can see each other at least. And by all means, talk in the chat. If there are issues you want to raise after the speakers have finished or questions to put, please put that in the chat. And if I don't notice, my colleagues Becky Howells and Rosie McClellan, who are doing really fantastic job behind the scenes and making this work, will draw my attention to it. So we have plenty of time for that. So the event will consist of 4 people making brief presentations, and then my colleague Anne Singleton, who is the policy champion in MMB Bristol and has been working in this topic for a long time, will try to bring together some of the policy implications for what we've discussed, and will help facilitate the question and answer and discussion part of the event. And we want to conclude by having some follow-up activities, because the purpose of this is not just to describe the world, but to change it. So our speakers will include Nadine Finch, who is an honorary senior policy fellow at the School for Policy Studies in the university, and has previously been a leading human rights barrister who's been involved in international legal issues concerning refugees, migration and human rights. She's worked with UNICEF, UNHCR and other international organizations, and brings a very important legal and national perspective to this topic. And we really welcome her participation in this. Also, another speaker after Nadine is finished will be Fuad Mohammed, who is actually sitting in the same office as me, but I can't actually see him, but he is here. And Fuad is the CEO of ACH. He came to the UK as a refugee, as a teenager, I think, and has successfully set up this organization that I'm now sitting in, which employs 80 people, and more importantly, helps 2,500 to 3,000 people a year from refugee and migrant backgrounds. And so has got both a personal lived experience as well as a unique perspective on this topic through the delivery of the work of ACH for refugee and migrant communities. And Fuad will be talking a little bit more detail about the national and wider perspectives on no recourse to public funds. Then we'll have David Barclay, who is the advisor to the Mayor on inclusion issues, and is working with Bristol Refugee Rights in relation to no recourse for public funds issues, and is going to put forward a Bristol model for how we might work with people who have got no recourse to public funds in this locality. And lastly, Caroline Broman is also working with Bristol Refugee Rights on the same topic, and has a background in this subject. And we welcome her contribution, which is going to look at some stories of individuals and their experience on living on no recourse to public funds in this city that we all live in, which is overall very affluent, but where there are large numbers of people who are not benefiting or enjoying that affluence, which I think is a concern for everybody who lives and works in Bristol, or indeed beyond that. So I think I can afford to stop speaking now and ask Nadine, who is our first speaker, to do her presentation.
Thank you, David. I'm reliant on the first slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk about the future, really, unfortunately, not very positive future, because there are going to be an increasing amount of people who don't have recourse to public funds, who used to have recourse to public funds in the future. And I've been following the Nationality and Border Bill, which is presently in the committee stage in the House of Commons. This bill is principally a response to the false narrative that's being put forward by the government, that the people coming across the English Channel in boats are mainly relatively rich young men who are pushing other refugees aside to reach the UK and paying human smugglers to do so. In fact, what's noticeable to me as a lawyer is there are many more children and women coming across the Channel in this way than used to come on lorries and Eurostar and planes in the past, which is interesting. It's also, for people who don't know, the English Channel is one of the busiest and most dangerous sea passages in the world. So anybody getting a boat to come across the Channel is certainly not just coming for benefits or hotels. As part of a deterrent, which is what the bill's all about, is deterrence, the government is creating two kinds of refugees, kind of good or first-class refugees and bad or second-class refugees. And that's the way they're hoping to bypass some of the international law. Now, as people know, there's been a hostile environment for refugees for some time now. We could date it back to 1996. Prior to that, asylum seekers got access to income support, although at a slightly lower rate, and they got access to council housing. That finished in 1996, and since then there's been a whole range of proposals to limit their access and make their life more precarious. But I have to say that this present proposals go way beyond that. They build on the existing acts, but they bring together a lot of what used to be speculation on behalf of the hard right, which is now in the bill. And I think for the civil society, sometimes at the moment is being rather optimistic about what will happen. But if one looks at what the government's already doing, for instance, at the Napier and Penhelly barracks, where they are putting people coming across the channel, one can see quite how seriously the government believes they can use no recourse of public funds and a much lower standard of care and accommodation to deter people. There is absolutely no research which indicates this will be successful. In the government's own Home Office research many years ago showed that very few asylum seekers understand, as many people in Britain don't understand, the vagaries of support. So why would they understand what support they were going to get when they got here? People flee because they got family here, because they speak English, and because they have some view that the UK is going to be a welcoming place, which is mainly historic and may also just be because some peers of their own have actually got asylum here. So the evidence base, both on the side of the government and the side of asylum seekers, is actually quite limited. Next slide. As I said, the radical difference in this bill is it actually is aimed at refugees. Up until now, the government has actually understood that their commitments in international law in the Refugee Convention means they have to offer the refugees a fair situation in which to claim asylum, which means they have to give them proper accommodation and support whilst they're claiming asylum. And also, once they've been given asylum, the Refugee Convention proposes that they give them the same kind of support as other people who need accommodation or who may be destitute in England. What's going to happen in this bill, which will most likely go through, is it's going to be a radical difference. UNHCR has done a very good paper about that. People may want to look at it. So the two classes of refugees are going to be, one, the so-called first-class refugees, who will be the people who leave their country, but wait patiently in a refugee camp or destitute in the street somewhere, waiting to be one of a very small number of people granted pre-settlement, granted a right to come here as a settled refugee. Now, the government's proposing that they will provide up to 20,000 places for Afghan refugees in the next 5 years. It's worth looking at exactly how many people are pouring out of Afghanistan at the moment. People like the UN reckon that since January this year, 600,000 Afghans have fled across their borders from the Taliban. So 20,000 places is a drop in the ocean in terms of the people needing support and refuge. The second class refugees, on whom these new proposals will bite, will be people who do not wait in the refugee camps, cannot reach a refugee camp, are too unsafe in a refugee camp, and who make their own way across Asia and Europe in seeking asylum and support. Now, the government makes a lot about young men, as I said, who push their way to the front, but in fact, the people most likely to take that journey are going to be unaccompanied children and women, because they're going to be the most vulnerable in refugee camps and destitute on the streets of cities across the world. So there is a false narrative also about who these people are who are going to come. Also, because there's no visa you can have to become a refugee, in the past, people came here, then claimed asylum. And in recognition of there being no visa, the British government would give them temporary admission. They won't actually let them enter the UK, but they would give them this temporary admission whilst their asylum claim was determined. This is going to go in this bill because at the moment, to enter illegally is obviously a criminal offence, but the government is going to make arriving a criminal offence. There's going to be no space, there's no temporary admission in which you can make an application. As soon as you arrive in the country, you'll be deemed illegal, and that will impact on whether you are a good or a bad asylum seeker, and will impact on whether or not you will be given access to the limited asylum support you get now. They do that by creating discretionary powers so that if you are a second-class refugee, they'll be able to impose a condition of no recourse to public funds. They'll also be able to do it to family members unless they happen to be a first-class refugee, either they've come from a refugee camp and they've been passed by the UNHCR and accepted by the UK for settlement. So it's going to be a very different landscape. At the moment, it's not clear how they're going to sort out the criminal offences of arrival with the fact the other people will be second-class refugees. And as I say, they're going to use discretionary power. Now, for non-lawyers, that's always a problem, and lawyers worry about discretionary powers because it means that no one's very sure how the government will use that power. It's down to their discretion. And it's difficult to challenge in law because discretion is a very large term. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, as well as the actual no recourse of public funds in terms of financial support, the government is making quite substantial changes to how it proposes to accommodate asylum seekers, and also a small period where failed asylum seekers get a period of accommodation till they move on. At the moment, they are able to get asylum support outside London, or they're able to stay in London or the southeast with relatives, for instance, and have some financial support. That's going to go. The government's going to have discretion that they will be able to place them in accommodation centres. Now, accommodation centres have been used before, but were called reception centres, such as Oakington, between about 2000 and 2010. They were heavily criticised. The healthcare was very poor, the food was very poor. They were putting people who were very traumatised in one place. They had children in there as well, there were fires. They know that these reception centres that they now are going to call accommodation centres are very problematic. There's also discretionary power to arrange for different types of accommodation. Now, this is the code for whether or not they be able to place people offshore in another country whilst awaiting determination of their asylum claim. Next slide. The debate on the accommodation centres is quite a real one at the moment. The only party really batting for refugees, in my view, is the SNP, and they're doing quite well at trying to hold the government to account. It's clear that the government is not going to put children with their families in accommodation centres. Doesn't mean they're not going to put the parents in the accommodation centre. And it doesn't mean that children who are wrongly assessed to be adults aren't going to be in there. They've also said it won't be detention, but when one looks at Napier Barracks, that is technically an accommodation centre, but it has high security fences, it has security guards, it has a curfew, it has quite stringent rules. It is a detention centre by any other name, and I suspect the accommodation centre will be as well. Next slide, please. Now, just very briefly, the Afghan families, as some of you will know, who are here already, who are entitled to indefinitely to remain because they are the good first-class refugees, are still in very poor quality hotels. There's at least 7,000 of them. And although local authorities offered accommodation, they're still awaiting the government response from central government to actually pass these people from the hotels to them. And some of those Afghans have been there ever since the first fall of Kabul. Next slide, please. And we may want to come back to this in questions, but for the first time ever, the hostile environment seems to be moving towards unaccompanied children. Now, children won't be liable for accommodation centres, but up until now, all unaccompanied children are treated like any other child and placed in the care of local authorities. Under Section 17 and Section 20, they get accommodation, foster care, supported accommodation, and they get all other services. This summer, since June, Home Office have been placing children in hotels on their own, in places like Brighton and Hove. The facilities have been very limited. The children have hardly been let out until very recently. There were no lawyers. So the government says there were nurses, but that's up for debate. But the most important thing is that because Brighton and Hove and Kent said they were full, which they weren't, the Home Office substitutes itself and says it's the corporate parent. There's no power in law for the Home Office to be a corporate parent. And they've been employing social workers who aren't held by any of the Children Act duties, at best to go and visit those children. This is a very new development, which is extremely worrying, and has to be viewed in the light of the fact the government has recently amended the bill so that it will be deciding if a child is a child, and its National Assessment Board, Age Assessment Board, which will be run by the Home Office with social workers employed by the Home Office. In my view, this is a very unfortunate and worrying development, which needs to be seen as part of the hostile environment. I'll stop there, and hopefully people ask questions later.
Okay, Nadine, thank you very much for that. A very sobering and mind-concentrating presentation. And I'm now going to move on to ask Fuad Mohammed, who's the CEO of ACH, to make his presentation, which I don't think will make us more cheerful, but will certainly make us more focused. And I do want us to focus on what we can do about this, whether locally or nationally, as well as just describe what is clearly, and everybody would agree, is a very unpleasant and unnecessary situation.
Thank you very much, Dave. What I would like to focus is to, first of all, give an introduction to what no recourse to public funding is, so we have a shared understanding. And as you quite rightly said, I genuinely believe there's plenty of solutions to this challenge, a challenge which I believe, ladies and gents, is not gonna go away. To be honest, a couple of years ago, this issue was on the periphery. I believe since the pandemic, when we've realized due to the everybody in policy, the extent of the no recourse to public funding, homeless people, that it's becoming now a major policy issue. I'm really glad we are having this discussion today. There are some challenges, but because ACH is an organization that actually works with refugees, so usually when people get their status and leave mass accommodation, the accommodation which Nadine have just been explaining, they come to us. So we have a lot of understanding in how to give them support, how to give them training, and most importantly, how to move them from poverty into employment, sustainable employment, and so that they can contribute to our economy and society. So in the first couple of minutes, I just want to introduce so that we have a shared understanding of what this is. So if you go to the next slide, some of these things have already been explained, and I'm not going to dwell too much about it. Please, let's have a discussion in the later on. So yeah, if you move on, please. The local governments are mandated because of the Section 17 Act to safeguard children. And it's because of this that a lot of families of non-recourse to public funding are supported. So I think, you know, this is a key one. I think it's also important to understand public funds, which means literally all the government funds available, including local government housing. They're not entitled to that. So there's you know, there's the argument of, you know, are these people refugees, especially if they are asylum seekers? You know, not all NRPF or non-recourse to public funding are asylum seekers, and we'll come to that in a minute. But those who are asylum seekers, you know, and even the wider group, there's the big question of the humanitarian concern, you know, and again, there's many actors that, you know, and policies that come into this, including the Geneva Convention. So should they be recognized as refugees? Why are we keeping them asylum seekers? How long do they stay during their asylum? All of these things are questions which, you know, we need, you know, we need to discuss further. In terms of the economic impact, is something I'm really keen to talk about, because the cost to this, to local government, is horrendous. So why actually are we keeping this group as a cost? And you know, there's some potential solutions I would like to discuss further. So if we move on to the next slide. You know, this is very straightforward, and I'm sure you all understand, but just to share it with you, the extent some of the current research is coming out, is sharing with us. There's, you know, it's estimated there's about 1.4 million people in the UK are classified as NRPF, of which majority of these are from the Black and ethnic minority communities. That is a staggering number. And as I said earlier, it is not only asylum seekers, so there are other migrants, there's EEA nationalists since Brexit that are in this group. It's also estimated, there's a report that came out from National Housing Federation, about 15,000 people have benefited the government every one in, which costed millions and millions of pounds. And you know, this is a policy which I really supported and believe it still should be continuing, but it has to stop. And locally, David will be speaking later on. Bristol, I believe there's about 60 people remaining, of which the cost have been, just to give you an idea, 20 something thousand about every week to the local government, just in terms of housing. So these are not small numbers, guys, and you know, my belief is these numbers will go away. So this is a very timely subject to discuss. If we move on to the next slide. I won't dwell too much on this, but just to give you an idea, majority of these families leave London, those who are classified in non-recourse to public funding. And you know, if you want to understand in terms of their immigration status, a lot of these are classified as overstayers. They have overstayed their limited leave to remain, or the period of the status that they had. Some of them came on a visa. In fact, when I brought my wife, she had non-recourse public funding. And this you know, further information about, I'm not quite sure whether this is a report that came a while ago, which said Jamaican and Nigerian nationals, majority of them forming about 50%. Whether that's still the case, I'm not quite sure. It'd be good to hear from the audience. But just this gives you an idea of the profile of the people that we are talking about. If we move to the next slide, please. This, I just want to have a little bit further discussion. Some of these things, which again are, you know, already have been highlighted by the presentation that came from Nadine. There's a lot of instances of abuse. Abuse, what we're talking about, is not only in terms of the accommodation, which so eloquently being explained by Nadine, but there's also the economic abuse. You know, there's some of actually the people I know here in Bristol who were not allowed to work. You know, sometimes if, you know, sometimes they actually do work illegally, and they are given very much less than what the law allows them to be paid, and this causes substantial abuse. And if you're a woman who a man have brought you into this country, there's the mental health exploitation, all of these things, and there's different levels of abuse and exploitation that could happen, and this is a major interest to social services. I say the word hidden because what I really want to share with you is majority of the people who are classified as no recourse to public funds are actually hidden in a such way that they do not actually want to talk to government, and they don't want to be found that they are in the country. A lot of these are the single people who their refugee application have been declined, and because of that we don't know about their existence. And so one way said 1.2 million, 1.4 million, it could well be higher. One of the key things I really wanted to discuss is when local governments are assessing the no recourse to public funds, the Section 17 Act says it should only be focused on the child. But in many cases, I think there's the focus on the adult. What they do, is there any income? The money that they are paid is so low. We're talking about, I think it's about 30, just over 30, 40 quid for single asylum seekers. And it is so low, probably about 50% of universal credit, which I believe is also low. So the money that is paid, the way it's assessed, there are some challenges, and I think one of the key ones, and there's the solutions I'm going to come to. I don't want to dwell too much on the challenges, but I want to share with you these things because they are important. One of the key things is how long these people stay, especially asylum seekers. They wait to hear a decision from the Home Office. Sometimes it's staying in support of the social services budget for as long as 3 years on average, or sometimes longer. And usually there's not much communication going on between the social services, the people who are supporting these, or if you don't get any support, the individuals and the Home Office, which exacerbates the time it takes for them to get decision. If we can move on. Now, I believe I've actually seen some people in the participants who are from Brexit, so it'd be really good to hear from you the amazing work that you are doing in London. So let's talk about solutions. There are some good models out there that people are using, and this is an organization that we have, Bristol, when I say we, have been having conversation with them. And one of the things I really like about this model, in terms of, is the focus on move on. So I don't want to speak for Brexit, and it'd be really good, the people, the participants, if they can join us later on. There's a social investment, a housing association have taken, and they are working with Brexit. They bought properties which are used to house the families, which local governments, social services refer to. But what they are doing in extra is these services actually have been co-designed by people with lived experience, which is really very, very important. But more importantly, the focus on helping people get access to immigration advice so that it doesn't take the 3-4 years long time to stay getting money from social services is very critical. And when they move and they get the status, they actually help them move into either social housing or private accommodation. So I think it's really critical to learn from that, from other cities and actually Bristol. And we are actually exploring how we could replicate something similar to this. Other ways that this can be done. There's actually other faith groups who've got nothing to do with housing associations or anything like that, who are keen with the monies that they have to buy housing to help these groups. Actually, groups like that actually have approached us and we are talking to possibly getting 1 or 2 properties in Bristol to house usually single people who would fall into this category. I believe there are faith groups all across the country that we can have conversation. I'll be able with, you know, philanthropists that we can have conversation with how they can help to get accommodation, which is one of the key challenges for this group, to, you know, how we can buy properties. Housing association is a potential solution. Another housing providers, you know, and again, I don't want to dwell too much on it, but when we get to the discussion, it will be really good to have discussion about how these different groups we can have conversation with, how they can provide some of the things that we want to need to put in place. So housing is one element of that. We're going to come to in a minute. Employment support training and a movement support will be critical in that process too. So if we go to the final slide, I believe. So these are the things that I believe we need to put in place. Each one of these will need different funding mechanism. Each one of these things, we cannot just wait the government to be the sole provider of this. And as I said, for example, housing, there's many different ways. So ACH, for example, we're a housing association. So usually we have a private landlord lease model. We have also taken social investment to buy properties. Another way of doing this would be to talk to the faith groups, philanthropists, and other people who might be interested to partially fund a property. One of the ways actually we are exploring currently right now in Bristol is councillors have properties which have been in long disrepair, and whether it is possible to take those properties, refurbish them, and take a pay-per-con rent from the councillors, so that we can then provide a cheap property to this group. So there's different housing models that can be used to support this. In terms of training, employment, and opportunity, it is absolutely important, because the only way these people can be, moved away from being reliant on the small money or the no money at all that they're getting is to give them the skills that they need, so that they become, the members of our economy. At this given time, there's huge vacancies in many different sectors: hospitality, retail, and when I said there is a solution, I really want to be seen, no recourse to public finance, one of the people that could potentially solve the biggest challenge that we are currently facing, which is actually finding employees who have got the right skills to join into our economy. And if we do that, then the private sector actually becomes part of the solution. They become part of the funders to this problem. So I just want to conclude by saying that. So the key thing is we really need people who can, at this given time, who can join the economy, especially on these sectors which have been vacated by the people who, because of Brexit. And I believe these are already people who are already in our country. If we give them the right skills, if we give them the right training, they should not be seen only as burden to society. These are people who've got skills and aspirations and can help. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that contribution. I think we could all agree that in a world where we have massive labour market shortages, to have people who are capable of doing some of those jobs and having them waiting around on minimal amounts of money really doesn't make any sense to anybody. That would be what I'd say. But anyway, let's move on now to the next two speakers, which are Caroline Broman and David Barclay. They've both been working with Bristol Refugee Rights on a project around no recourse to public funds and the local model. I think Caroline is briefly going to talk about some real life examples of people who face this problem. So far, we've talked in the abstract, but I think to focus down on individual examples is very important. And then David's going to conclude by looking at a Bristol model for how we might be able to move forward on this. So Caroline, your floor is yours, as they say.
Thanks, and hi everybody. So yeah, my name's Caroline and I work for Bristol Refugee Rights, which is a frontline organisation here in Bristol, giving advice and support to asylum seekers or largely individuals who've at some point been through the asylum system. And we've been working in partnership with David and with RAMP on a project looking at what Bristol can do better and more to support people who are subject to NRPF. And my role in that has to been to bring people with lived experience, real people who live in Bristol, into that conversation. So we're listening to them, we're hearing their stories, and we're using that to build our model for what we want support to look like in Bristol. So David's going to tell you a lot more about the model. I'm just going to talk about some of the real people and their stories. It would have been great if some of the people had come along today to talk to you directly, but as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of barriers for people in terms of speaking out. Many people want to remain anonymous. Many people lacking confidence, barriers around English. So I'm here today to tell you some of what they've told me. I'm hoping to touch upon 3 people's stories. We'll see if I manage it. Hopefully I'll definitely do 2. And I'm going to try and capture the range of experiences and the range of people who are affected by no recourse to public funds, because it is a really wide range of people. So the first person's story that I'd like to share with you today is Dana. So Dana arrived in the UK as an asylum seeker. He wasn't originally housed in Bristol under the Asylum Support system. He was housed up north. But his first asylum claim was refused. He had the right to appeal, as all asylum seekers do, but he wasn't able to find a solicitor to help him with his appeal. So he went to his appeal by himself, tried to represent himself. His appeal wasn't successful. So he was then evicted from his asylum support accommodation, as is the Home Office's policy. So he was now completely homeless and completely destitute here in the UK. And while he'd been making his claim, Dana had met some people from the same community as his, Kurdish people, who lived in Bristol. So desperate and not knowing what else to do, he came alone to Bristol to try and find some community who could support him. In some ways he did. The Kurdish community in Bristol sometimes would let him stay on their sofa for a night. This is what we're talking about with hidden homelessness. So he might not be on the streets, but really he has nowhere to go. Some restaurants owned by Kurdish people in Bristol would give him a free meal sometimes. But Dana also spent most of his time sleeping in a tent in Eastville Park. As you can imagine, the impact that this had on both his physical and mental health was huge. And during this time, Dana was keen to reinstate contact with the Home Office and try and put in a new immigration application. But when he tried to contact them, he couldn't understand the systems. He just wasn't able to do it independently. So this was where Dana was when it came to COVID in 2020. But you've heard it mentioned, in 2020, there was a new government policy called Everyone In, which said, because it's a public health emergency, and you can't self-isolate to protect yourself or others if you're living on the streets, there was money for local authorities for the first time to house people, whether or not they were subject to no recourse to public funds. So Dana was given a room in a hotel here in Bristol. So for the first time since he arrived in Bristol, he had a stable room where he could lock the door, wash his clothes, have a shower, and be safe. And Dana says, as you might imagine, it was incomparable to where I was before. He also started to receive weekly destitution payments from a local charity. They were only £10 a week, but when you previously had no access to income or any cash whatsoever, this allowed Dana to buy some of the essentials, and he was provided with food in the hotels. So he was fed. The impact on his health of being in Everyone In, he says 100% different, his health, while he was in Everyone In. And he was also able to start accessing some immigration advice. So he was, with some help from local organisations in Bristol, he started working with a solicitor. who got back in touch with the Home Office and was working with him towards putting in a fresh asylum claim. So gathering new evidence to put in a fresh claim. But then in the winter of 2021, Dana was told, along with everyone else who was still in the hotels, that everyone in was going to end. He was still working with this solicitor to put in the fresh claim, but gathering evidence can take a really, really long time. Normally takes around a year at least to put in a fresh claim. So he wasn't yet in a sort of stable immigration position. As you can imagine, this was very stressful and worrying. He wasn't sure if he was going to have to be homeless again and how he would engage with the solicitor. But thankfully, he was able to find a bed space by another charity in Bristol who supports people in this exact position, people who are trying to work on a fresh claim and need that stability in order to be able to do that. So thankfully for Dana, since he was housed through everyone in, he's not had to go back on the streets. And I believe actually now, since I did this interview with him and spoke to him, his fresh claim has been submitted. So that means he is eligible for asylum support accommodation again. And hopefully with the support of a good solicitor, this time he will have a successful claim. So when we asked Dana, what's the most important thing for you in terms of what could have been better, what more could have been done to support people with no recourse to public funds in Bristol? He said, unsurprisingly, the biggest thing was accommodation. For him, without the accommodation, he just wasn't able to access the advice. He wasn't able to move his claim forward. His health was poor, his mental health was poor. So everyone in has changed everything for Dana. And the second thing that he said was important was that help with immigration, that immigration advice, so that he could restore contact with the Home Office. That's that move on. So that then he's on a pathway towards having a stable way to remain in the UK. And then he might need that other support around employment and the sort of support ACH offers in the future. So that is Dana. The second person I'd like to tell you about is Victoria. So Victoria came to the UK long time ago now, in 2004, from an African country on a working visa. She was working as a domestic cleaner, and after her visa was for 2 years. So after 2 years, she applied to have her visa extended by the Home Office. It was extended, and this pattern went on. So for many years, she was here working in the UK, always on temporary visas, always on visas that were subject to no recourse to public funds. But it didn't matter because she was working, she was paying taxes, and she was supporting herself. But in 2010, she put in her visa extension request like she had every other year. But this time it was refused by the Home Office. The Home Office declined to extend her visa, which made Victoria into a visa overstayer. So she was now in the UK with no paperwork. And therefore, because she had no paperwork, she was no recourse to public funds. And similarly to Dana, she became completely reliant on her community and family friends for support. So she was moving around, sleeping in different people's living rooms every night. What she says about this time was, this was very difficult for me. Sometimes I don't want to remember this time. When I think about it, I get anxious. Similarly to Dana, her health was hugely impacted by this. She had big problems with anxiety, big problems with her blood pressure, which reached over 200, whatever you measure blood pressure in. Sorry, I don't know. Victoria probably told me. She was able to access the GP, but she was always very worried when she was accessing services. She didn't want anyone to know about her visa situation, so she never ever disclosed the full complexity of her situation. To add to the complexity of her situation, in 2015, Victoria became pregnant and had a son. So she was now sofa surfing, moving around, nowhere permanent to stay, her and her newborn baby. And she did this for years, until her son was about 2 years old, when she heard from a friend about Section 17 of the Children's Act, which we've heard mentioned, which might mean that she could get some support from social services. And she was able to approach Bristol City Council and to start getting support from social services. So she got a very small stipend of money every week, and a room where she and her son could live. So they live in one room now. They're still supported under Section 17 of the social services, sharing a bed because they only have one bed. Her son's going to school, but life continues to be very difficult. As her son gets older, Victoria feels more and more uncomfortable about sharing a bed and sharing the space. And she also feels, she says, like a bad parent, like she's not able to offer her son the sort of things other families can. So he's asking her about traveling abroad, for example, now he's getting older. And she doesn't know how to explain to him that they can't do that because they have no paperwork, they have no visas, they have no passports. She's scared to take him to the football club because she's worried they might ask her about the immigration status. She's living in fear. Again, she has been referred to a solicitor and is working on making an application, but these things take a really long time. And Victoria says, I don't know the way forward. She feels like she can't plan. And she feels frustrated. She feels like people like her, these are her words, just piling up here in the UK. And then she sees these headlines about, 90,000 carer vacancies. These are all jobs that Victoria can and would do if she was able to get the paperwork to do it. So she says there's people here with skills, people who want to work, but they don't have the right. They could fill these positions in care jobs in nursing if they were just given the training and opportunity to do so. So very much what Fuad was saying, that is how she feels. She wants to contribute, but right now she isn't able to. And she also feels like her son is being punished for something that, growing up without access to public funds that he is innocent in. So she says, children are innocent in this. They don't belong in any other place. The only place they know is here. My son, he does not even speak my language. So Victoria's things that she wants to know as the most important things to make difference for people who are subject to no recourse to public funds is housing. Again, like so many others, it's impossible to rebuild your life, get your immigration advice without suitable housing, and suitable is key. So, that you might be given somewhere to stay, but it doesn't necessarily give you that building block unless it's a safe, stable place to stay. But she also says that what's really important is people listening to her and other people like her with a focus on really thinking about a long-term solution to their situation, both as individuals and as, these 1.4 million people who might be struggling in the UK. So I think that's important for just thinking about, the power of being listened to. That is 2. I don't know if I have time to do number 3. I'm just checking.
I think we need to.
No, okay, I don't. That's 2. There's many more. They've all got very different experiences, but I hope it was good to hear a little bit from people firsthand.
No, Caroline, that was really good and really important, and thanks for that. Sorry to cut off your third person, but I'm sure there could be 100 cases like that. But thanks really for your contribution. And just ask David Barclay to be the next speaker to conclude the formal presentation part of this event. But please do stay on for the conversation afterwards.
Thanks, David, and great to be here. Thanks for asking me to speak. So Caroline mentioned in Donnas Story the importance of everyone in and the change that has made to how people with no recourse to public funds have been supported in this country. And what made the difference during Everyone In was not just the provision of accommodation for people who might not previously have been eligible for that support, but also the way in which different organisations work together to provide a kind of holistic package of support. So for people like Dana and others, the council worked very closely with lots of voluntary sector organisations to think about different kinds of support that people might need, so that when the Everyone In policy came to an end, there was a plan, there was a place that they could move on to. And this concept of the Bristol model of NRPF support is really about trying to learn the lessons of what was possible during the pandemic and extend those beyond the life of the Everyone In policy, which has now come to an end. And so the key features of it are that it's a collaborative model. It involves lots of different organisations working together as part of what we call the One City approach in Bristol. And it's a holistic model. So it's about trying to see people as people who need a variety of different kinds of support and encouragement, and break away from a kind of siloed approach where different organisations provide different kinds of support, and people are expected to somehow kind of navigate all of those different services and get everything that they need. So if we go to the next slide, the way in which we've structured this Bristol model is through 4 key principles. And these principles have been adopted from another initiative in Scotland, which is also on NRPF, called the Everyone Home Collective. And we just thought that they fitted perfectly with our kind of values as a city of sanctuary and what we wanted to achieve in Bristol. And so the 4 principles are, at the bottom there, you can see there's one called Design Out Destitution. And what that means is that trying to find ways to make sure that people aren't stuck with no access to money, that they have the basic necessities, that they have things like access to transport where they need it. And we've got a destitution payment system in Bristol. So part of the building the Bristol model is getting more resource into that system and making sure that those payments are going to the right people and that they're the right level to be able to enable a basic kind of standard of living for people who would otherwise be destitute. The next principle is informed and supported. And this is the idea that people should have information that they need and should be supported in various different ways. We heard already the importance of legal advice, and that's a big challenge in Bristol, is securing sufficient immigration advice for people of the right quality. And also we've heard about the importance of supporting people into work where they have the right to work. And so again, the conversation around informed and supported is how can we make sure that people know what support is available for them and that we can increase the capacity of that support, make it accessible, make it effective for them. The third principle is called included and involved. And this is the idea that people should have the chance to be part of the decisions that affect them and that their stories should be heard. You heard about the great work that Caroline and Bristol Refugee Rights have been doing, gathering those stories. And Caroline's been working with some of those people that she mentioned to feed back on the development of this model and to give their thoughts on what actually would make a difference to them. What do these principles mean to them, so that it's not just a conversation amongst professionals about what these things mean, but it's actually people with that lived experience with those stories who get to shape what this model means in practice. And then the final principle is safe place to stay, which, as it suggests, is about providing accommodation for people, which is not just a kind of a dorm, something which but which is more safe and secure for people and something that's accessible for them. So the task in developing this Bristol model is how do we make these principles real for as many people as possible? And how do we demonstrate that this collaborative and holistic model actually works? We know from the experience of Everyone In and from some of the anecdotal stuff that Caroline and others have been collecting, that if we can make these principles real, we can really change people's lives. But the task for us, I think, as a city, as different organizations, is how can we work together to make sure that as many people as possible can benefit from all of these principles, or as many as they require, as many as they need at different times, and not just have access to one little piece of the puzzle and miss out on the support that might come from other organizations or in other ways. And so that's what we are working on at the moment. The RAMP project, which myself and my colleague Forward, Massaquadzo, are part of, involves us being seconded into the council. So I work within the city office team, Forward works within the mayor's office team. And from those positions, we are working both within Bristol City Council to try and focus our colleagues' attention and different resources that the council might have towards the development of this model, but also to be a bridge and a conduit between the council and other key actors, whether it's housing providers or whether it's the voluntary sector, advice providers, and others. And what we're working on is can we find can we connect things up so it's easier for people to access and to understand? Can we make some simple changes that might make this these principles real for people? And then can we find the resource that we might need to coordinate this in the longer term, and to do some evaluation work so that we can demonstrate that actually providing support in this way leads to much better longer term outcomes. As Fuad mentioned, the costs to local authorities and to others of having to provide temporary accommodation for people is very high. And so if we can create a model where actually we're able to support people, but we're also able to help them move on and to change their status and get access to public funds, then that I think could be quite a game changer and really help us demonstrate that working in this way is cost effective as well as being morally the right thing to do. So I think that's it from me for now.
Okay, so thank you very much to David Bartley for that last presentation, which I think very succinctly in that diagram illustrates some of the things that could actually be done locally and regionally to progress and make this a better situation. So we now move to a point where we're going to stop talking and we try to open up this to a discussion. Anne Singleton, who is the policy champion for migration and Mobilities Bristol, and indeed is working with ACH on a daily basis on our project around migrant and refugee entrepreneurship, is going to maybe curate, is a trendy phrase, isn't it? Curate this discussion. So I don't know if Anne wants to make a few little comments to start off with. If people do want to make a comment or ask a question, then please either raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'll try and notice it, but if I don't, my invisible but important colleagues Becky and Rosie will surely draw my attention to it. So I'll stop.
Thank you, David. And thank you to Nadine, Fuad, Caroline and David for the excellent presentations, in which I learned so much I couldn't stop writing notes. Trying to pull out themes was not as difficult as I expected, because I think several of the same themes were touched on by each or all of you. And the themes that I noticed that relate to policy issues include the following. Firstly, of course, law and legislation and what seems to be happening, which is not just removing whatever protection there may have been, but actually criminalising people arriving, criminalising children, as Nadine pointed out, and the misinformation about this, the lack of understanding at public level at policymakers and refugees about the detail and the consequences of these legislative changes were quite shocking, even though I thought I knew this field, and I still have to learn to be shocked by what is happening and what is coming down the line. Secondly, on communications, the poverty of communications very often between government departments, in this case, the Home Office and local authorities, when we see good practice and good initiatives coming at local level, and yet poor communications about how things could be improved nationally and what the consequences of national decisions are. And the themes that struck me very strongly are that housing and accommodation is a crucial element which frames the lives of people affected by all the legislative situations, but also the long-term impact of the experiences that they have to live through. Housing and accommodation, but also employment, crucially that people can see solutions and see solutions for the future, which are going to be economically and socially advantageous to the whole population, which because of the criminalisation of employment and of any access to services, is resulting in harm that is affecting everybody, not just those directly affected, and also access to health services. So again, this having an impact on children, on babies, on mothers, parenting, and all the experiences there in regards to national and local policies. So that's been a really hard and serious set of information to listen to. And then, yeah, I'm struck by the positive elements of the discussion and the need for that several people have mentioned to advocate for change at national level to advocate for policies and practices which will create a better situation for everyone. This includes regarding housing and legal advice and health services. The examples of praxis in London, which would be good to hear something about, the example of the Bristol model and the emphasis on having a place to stay and the need for information and access to legal services. And really, I think I'll stop there. I think there's plenty that everyone's heard that we can get involved in a discussion around. And I think it would be very helpful if we could keep this conversation and network going after this event to share experience and knowledge and to learn about best practice and how to positively advocate for changes that are going to address what is coming down the line, as we've been warned by Nadine, but also what can be done about this. So I think I'll leave it there, David. Those are just the points that struck me. Thank you.